let's recap the main nekudas. What was the Alter Rebbe's kasha at the beginning of the Perek? The main kasha is not why does it say v'yodaito. What's the kasha? What's the problem? Somebody can have a question. Somebody can have an idea that there's another elikim. And v'yodaito, you should know that it's not like that. Why shouldn't it occur to somebody such a thing? So the question is not on the idea, the question is on v'hashivei levavecha. If somebody misunderstands something, you have to tell him what the answer is, but you don't have to tell him v'hashivei levavecha. So obviously we're talking about a idea, some type of idea, which is not only a seichel dik'inyan, but it's something that is not easy for a person to accept in his heart. And that's why it says v'hashivei levavecha. We're talking about an idea which is very difficult to accept. You have to understand what is so difficult to accept that the Eibishter is the only Balabas of the world. So the Alter Rebbe is going to answer that question later on. When we jumped ahead a little bit to explain what the main issue is that's difficult to understand, the main nekuda is what it's going to explain later is that Ein Oid doesn't just mean there's no other Eibishter hiding under the ground in the sea. The real meaning of Ein Oid will be that there's no other Metzius at all. There's nothing else. And this is something that doesn't make sense. On the one hand it says Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'haaretz, that means the Eibishter did create a world. On the other hand, you're saying Ein Oid, there's nothing else. How could that be? By the time we get to the end of Perek Beis, the Gimel will begin to understand how such a concept can make sense. But that's the main nekuda of Ein Oid, that in the end it's going to mean there's nothing else. In order to get to understand that, the Alter Rebbe is makdim the Teres of Baal Shem Tov. What does the Baal Shem Tov say? What's the chiddush of the Baal Shem Tov? Baal Shem Tov says, La'olam Hashem Tvoch and Mitzvah Shomayim, that the Dvar Havaya has to be inside the Shomayim the whole time. For if it would disappear, the Shomayim L'Oretz would disappear. That's the famous Teres of Baal Shem Tov. We mentioned also that the famous question is, it's not just the Baal Shem Tov said that these are words from the Medrash. The Medrash on the Pasuk of Le'olam Hashem says the same thing, that the world depends on the Dvar Havaya. So what's the chiddush of the Baal Shem Tov? From different places it comes out clearly that the Baal Shem Tov was meisif a prat which is not clear in the Medrash. The prat is the inyan of Islapshus. The first nekuda which comes out from the Medrash, which the Baal Shem Tov repeats, is that the Olam needs a Dvar Havaya kol rega v'rega, and without the Dvar Havaya, the Metzius would disappear. That makes sense. That says in Medrash Rabbah, that's not a chiddush. The chiddush of the Baal Shem Tov is in the words when he translates the word Bashamayim. Le'olam Hashem Tvoch and Mitzvah Bashamayim, says the Alter Rebbe, the Seich Reki Hashamayim. But the Dvar Havaya is not just holding the Metzius of the Shamayim, that it should continue to exist, but he's B'teich Reki Hashamayim, he's Bislabish inside the Rekiah. That means there's no level of the Rekiah which is not Duchgenum, which is not permeated with Elokus. How else could it be? How could there be a dependency on the Dvar Havaya and not be Bislabshus? Where do we find such a musig of something that's dependent totally on something else, but there's something else is not Bislabish in him? What could be an example of such a thing? In other words, La Fukimai, you could have such a situation like the Eir HaShemesh from the Shemesh. The Eir HaShemesh is dependent totally on the Shemesh itself, Kol Rega V'Rega, and as soon as the Shemesh, the Shkiyas HaChamo, the Eir disappears, that means the Eir is dependent on the Moir, obviously. But that doesn't mean to say that the Shemesh is mislabish in the Eir. The Eir is a ziv which is misrachik from the Moir, and the Rekiah is in one. The Shemesh is in one place in the Rekiah, and the Oir is mispashet everywhere else. So the Oir is dependent on the Moir, but the Moir is not mislabish in the Oir. Here the chiddush is that Dvar Havaya is not over there, and the Nivra is mispashet from him somewhere else. The Dvar Havaya is inside the Nivra. There's no part of the Nivra which is outside of the Tchum of Elokus. There's no self at all, no space. The Gashmius and Baruchnius has no space of its own. It's all within, together with the Dvar Havaya. And he'll elaborate on that later on. The what seems to come out overall in this Perek is that the union of constant Tmidius needed Vahavai, but the Rebbe makes a point clearly that it's also the union, this second Nakuda of his slapshus. Now, where we're up to, more or less inside is where the Alter Rebbe now takes it a step further. Where do you see his slapshus in all the Nivroim? He brings on Taka from the Arizal that we find that even the Arizal says that even a Doimim has a Nefesh V'chayis Ruchnis, which he says means the slapshus of the Dvahavaya. But that's all fine and good to say from the Kisvei Arizal. But where do we find what is mislabish in the Nivra Asara Mamoris? Where do you find Asara Mamoris being mislabish in an Evin? In the Rakia we had a pasuk. Dvacha Nitzav Hashemayim. Says the Alter Rebbe, it's not just the Rakia, it's also Nivroim down here. Fine, so it's also Nivroim down here. Where do you see that the Dvahavai is mislabish in an Evin, for example? This is the question over here. Let's look at it inside. 4 lines from the bottom of the page, 152. He says, "Va'af shalei huske shem even b'asara mamoris." What is the question over here? A lot of people understand the question over here, meaning that "Va'af shalei huske even b'asara mamoris" means that there's so many nivroim. How can you say from Asara Mamoris there's a slapshus in so many nivroim? There's a ribu nivroim, and there's only Asara Mamoris. How can you say a slapshus? But that's not exactly the question about mitzad ribu nivroim. The question is not mitzad there's so many nivroim. The question is, since the Evan is not mentioned in Asara Mamoris, so there is no mimer that can be mislabish in the Evan. Let's say it again. If the question is mitzad ribu nivroim, va'av shalei huske shem even b'asara mamoris, so what's the question? There's no mimer for an Evan, so what? He's not, in other words, he's not just asking about avonim, he's asking about all nivroim which are not mentioned in Asara Mamoris. What's the question? Is the question mitzad that there's too many maimorim, there's only 10 maimorim and there's too many nivroim? Is that the question, mitzad ribui? The question is not mitzad ribui, because if that would be the question, then how can you have so many nivroim coming out from Asara Mamoris, then which Sefer Yetzirah would he bring down? Which is the famous Sefer Yetzirah that's brought down all over the place to tell you that from one thing you can get ribui inyanim. Shtei avonim b'einis shnei batim. Shalosh avonim b'einis shalosh batim. And what's the end of the Sefer Yetzirah? Sevech hashoy v'ad she'ein apei yachol ledaber, something like that. In other words, if you're looking for ribui, so the Seder is this siruf, and then you mitzaref another letter, and another letter, you get to a ribui ad ein sof. They say a Maisa once of a Chassidish shtibel in Russia somewhere. The Chassidim used to fabring a lot of times. And what's the most thing that the Chassidim talk about in the fabring? Chassidus, Davnen, Rebbe, Chassid, that was the same. And in the same shtibel used to sit a person who wasn't a Chassid. He would never join in, but secretly he would listen the whole time what's going on. He's learning his Gemara, but he was listening to what's going on. One day he exploded. He said to the person that he used to speak to, he said, "I don't understand you Chassidim. You say the same thing every day. You say Chassid, Rebbe, Davnen, Lerner, Chassidus, Rebbe, Chassid, Davnen. It's the same things repeat over. How many times can you repeat the same thing?" So the Chassid said, "You see this shafar? 100 of songs over here on the shafar? The same 22 letters. Same 20, Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dal. It's the same 22 letters. But each sefer is totally different from the other one. Once you mitzaref the Oish is different, it's totally different. So mitzad ribui, all you need to do is bring down the Sefer Yetzirah, but there's a system of tzirufim. But notice the Alter Rebbe doesn't bring down that Sefer Yetzirah. What's the answer to the question of Afshalei Huska Shem Evin? Afal Pikein, Nimshe Chayes LeEvin al Yidei Tzirufim v'chilufe Oisis HaMisgalgalos Bereish Lamed Aleph Sharim Panim v'Ochik Mishkasa v'Sefer Yetzirah. Ad Shemishtal Shol down to Evin. What type of Sefer Yetzirah is this? What's this Reish Lamed Aleph Sharim Panim v'Ochik? And why doesn't it just go to the simple Sefer Yetzirah? That Tzirufim create a Ribui. So the question was not on Ribui. That's not the question. The question is, again, the Nakuda of the Baal Shem Tov of Islabshus. If you're going to say that the Asara Mamoris are mislabish in the Nivra, If you're going to worry about ribui, so how does, look, that's not a kasha on the Alter Rebbe. Bechlal, half masar mamoris, you get to a ribui nivroim. You have millions of nivroim, you have 10 maimoris. How do you manage that? The answer is that the maimorim are maimorim kloliyim. Like Chazal say on the pasuk, Bereishis ba'alakim, es hashamayim l'rabis etzvaehem, ve'esaris l'rabis tzvaeha. The Shemayim doesn't just mean Hashemayim, it means everything that's included within the Shemayim. Eretz includes everything that's in the Shemayim. And there's 10 Maimoros which are klali, which include a ribui. So that's not a problem how you get to a ribui nivroim. The question is, you didn't just tell me there was a ribui nivroim. This we know from Fasar Maimoros Nivroim. The Baal Shem Tov said that the Maimah is mislabish in the Nivra. So let's think for a second. The Maimah that says Yehir Okiyah or Es HaShomayim, which includes all the nivroim that's in the Shamayim, is mislabish in what? In the Shamayim. Ve'es ha'oretz, which is kernel all the nivroim sheba'oretz, is mislabish where? In some way ba'oretz, which includes everything. But if you're going to say it's mislabshus inside every nivra, that means the same maimah which creates billions of nivroim is now being mislabish in an even, which is one sug of nivra. How does a klal fit inside a prat? If Islabshus means it's going into the nivra fi erke, this is a maimah klali. How does it fit inside a inyan prati, in an even achas? So that's what he says. There is no maimah that can be mislabish in an even. How did you get? If there would be the word even in that Asar Mamoris, I understand it came down into the even. So this part of the maimah. In other words, let's take the sun. Let's take our example of the sun and the oil. The fact that the oil spreads all over the world makes sense. The sun is over there, and he's spreading a ribu oil to all the nivroim which are others will not. But the sun can't be mislabish in your dining room. How's it going to fit inside? He's a sun which is shaykhus to the whole kadahoritz and plus a lot more. He's not going to fit inside your dining room. So how did you get a maimer leki, which is a sun, which is a mocker for a ribu nivroim, to fit inside an even? So the Alter Rebbe says, I'll tell you how it works. A different way. There's a system called Reish Lamed Aleph Panav Sha'arim Panav V'Acher. What does that mean? Let's say we don't know what it means, which most of us don't, right? What the Reish Lamed Aleph Sha'arim means. But the Alter Rebbe is not talking to Mukubalim. That's one of the klolim of Tanya. Tanya is not a Sefer Kabbalah. And where the Alter Rebbe can circumvent Sefer Kabbalah, he will. If he can get out of mentioning basis of Kabbalah, he will. He'll mention Lashon of Chazal, Lashon Shonis of Psukim. The Rebbe brings this down clearly if you go back to Perek Alef Beis Gimel, where he starts talking about the Shechina. He says the word Shechina, he says the word Matronisa. He uses all different Lashonis from Zohar, Midrashim and Chazal. But he doesn't give you an address and say the Ishtalshus that we're talking about Malchus Datzilus. In the end, he mentions it's Malchus Datzilus. Why doesn't he mention the beginning? Which sphere we're talking about? Surely we need an address. We're starting out, understand what the Shechina is. Tell us which sphere it is. No, he doesn't speak Sifrei Kabbalah. He doesn't speak that language. He speaks the Inyan. And where he needs to bring a raya from Kabbalah to be Messiah to as a proof or as a Yisoid, he goes to Sifrei Kabbalah. But that's only if he needs it. If he doesn't need it, he's not going to use Sifrei Kabbalah. Here, the Alter Rebbe brings down Sifrei Kabbalah, nobody has any clue what he's talking about. What's this? Reish Lamed Sha'arim Panav V'Acher. Where have we heard of that? Where is it explained? Kemat not mentioned. It's mentioned here and there in Likutei Torah and in other places, but it's not one of the major subjects in Chassidus. So, why would he mention it? We're going to have to say that even without understanding what it is, we'll get to what it is in a second, as much as we can understand, but even without understanding what it is, the words that it says here is enough for us, which negir le'inyoneinu. So what does it say here? What do you see from these words, which is enough of an answer to answer us how the Maimoris can fit inside an Even? Nimshur chayes le'even al yedei tzirufim v'chiluf v'eses ha'misgabelis b'reish Lamed Sha'arim Panav V'Acher k'mo shekosov v'sefer Yitzirah ad shemishtalsho ma'asar Maimoris v'nimshur chayes tzir shem Even v'hu chayosu shel Even. What words do we see over here which stand out from the Sefer Yitzirah? Rosh Hashanah is obviously going to be a technical issue of numbers. We'll get to that in a second. But which words stand out? The Cha'eret says clearly two words. Panim V'Acher. What does Panim V'Acher tell you? Well, let's ask a simple question. Is there any difference in the Kedushas HaOisius in between the Maimoris? Is one Maimon more important than the other? Is one Maimon more Kaddish than the other? Or higher Madrega than the other? Or it's all Oisius HaTorah? All Oisius HaTorah? Shouldn't be any Madregas. There's no Mairo Mata. But in Sefer Yitzir it says that there's Panim V'Ocher. Panim V'Ocher means what? Without knowing what it means L'mayla, a simple translation of Panim V'Ocher means the face and the back. Right? The face of a person has all the Keiches HaNailim of the person, and the Ocher there's nothing there. Also in Inyan, we know the Chlal, Panim is Pnimius, Ocher is the Chitzonius. Panim is obviously going to be higher than Ocher. In other words, from Sefer Yitzirah we have a Yesod to understand that there is Milo Mata in Oisius of Kedusha as well. It's not all one, same Oisius, everything's the same, it's just different letters. No, in Oisius somehow there's Panim V'Ocher, there's Milo Mata. If there's Milo Mata, so now we already see that in Kedusha, somewhere along the lines, whatever this Reish Lamed Aleph Sharim is, that somewhere over there is a system which makes Milo Mata in Oisius, which we call Panim V'Ocher. If there's Milo Mata in Oisius, so now we know that there's a system how things do have different Madrigas, even in Oisius of Kedusha. And therefore, Mishtalshul, Masalam Amoris, and there could be a tziruf to something which is lower. Just like you have Shamayim, and you have Eretz, and you have even lower things. You can have Hishtalshulus, that's where he uses the word Ad Shemishtalshul Masalam Amoris. So in other words, the Alter Rebbe has to use a mocker to tell us that there's Ma'ila Mata or Panim V'Ocher in Kedusha. So that's the mocker. The mocker is from Sefer Yitzir. Just to make it slightly more easier to understand what are these Reish Lamed Aleph Sha'arim, how do you get to the number Reish Lamed Aleph? It's just simply the truth is there's many different shittas as to how to be mitzaref the Oisius. But just to make it as straightforward, if you can imagine, write down all the 22 letters of the Aleph base, from Aleph till Tov. That's a tziruf ala seder, from Aleph till Tov. Now in the next line, line number 2, you're going to be mitzaref Aleph, not with base and the rest of the letters. You're going to take base out and put him at the end. It's a new tziruf. So you've got Aleph, Gimel, all the way till Tov, and then comes the base. And then the third line is going to be Aleph, Gimel. The third line is going to be Aleph Dalet. The first one was Aleph, Base, Gimel, Dalet. The second one is Aleph, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, until the end, and then it became Aleph, Base at the end. And the third one is going to be Aleph, Dalet, Aleph, Hey, Aleph, Vav, Aleph, Zayin, Aleph, Ches. How many lines am I going to have over here?
22.
Huh?
22 lines.
Are you sure? There's 22 letters. How many lines am I going to have? 21. The first one is already Aleph base. I don't have to do twice Aleph base. I've got Aleph base, Aleph Gimel, Aleph Dalet. So the first one is base till Tov. So there's 21 lines. How much is 21 times 22? I know some of you may have learned in Oli Torah, it may be difficult, but how much is 21 times 22? Well, 20 times 20 is 400. That's more or less straightforward. Well, I only know because it says here 231, Panim V'Ocher, so double 231 is 462. So 21 times 22 is 462. And then the top half is going to be Panim, and the bottom half is going to be Ocher. How did it become Panim V'Ocher? It should be Ma'ilo Mata, simple language. The truth is, there's a Lakuti Levi Yitzchak in Pashas Truma where he explains it in the Lashon of the Zohar. And the Lashon of the Zohar is, he calls the top half Eila, means Elyon, and Tato, Tachton. The thing is, it says in Sefer Yitzir, or not so clear in Sefer Yitzir, in other Svarim, it says that those Oisius which are spread out like that, we're taking one shitta, there maybe there's plenty of other shittas, that you have 22 letters with 21 lines, which makes all the letters 400 and what did we say, 62, is it says that there was a tzimtzum in these Oisius. These oisius, remember we only did ois aleph. We've got to do the same thing for ois base aleph, base gimel, base daled, base vav, and etc. Until you get to base mem. So if you come across in a mimer oisius album, you'll know what he's talking about. The first shar is al, the middle line is aleph lamed, and the second shar is base mem, the middle line. The middle line is negeh because up until the top half is the chelik ha'elin of the oisius, and then it says there was a tzimtzum in the lower half that they were niskapel like a talus, niskapel backwards, and so this became ocher to that. So that's panim v'ocher. And there was another machin panri over here, and then the whole seder shtalshus happened over there. This is a little bit into outside the thing, but it is mentioned occasionally. This is called kippul hamalbush, the folding of the malbush. So these oisius are called sha'arim, and the top half is called panim, and the bottom half is called ocher. So you have reish lamed aleph sha'arim panim, and reish aleph lamed aleph sha'arim ocher. That just the voice aleph, and the same thing ois base, and the same thing all the way till tov. What's the chiddush of all of this? Again, the main thing is to show you that there is such a thing as Ma'ila Mata. It wasn't all the same level. There's Ma'ila Mata, there's Madregas, and there's Ishtalshalos. And therefore it makes sense that you can have a Ma'ima Leki, which is klali to Nivroim, which are going to be created, the Fedish from these things. It says it clearly in Torah. Yehir Rakia is going to be created directly. And then there's Nivroim, which you're going to get with Bechinas Acher. They're not going to get directly. It's going to be Nishtalshel, Misgalgal. It's going to roll over the Derech Acher until it comes down to a Nivra, which is the Mata Yesa. And that's why he explains later. The reason why is because not every Nivra can receive directly from Asar Mamoris. He has to go through a system to sort of dilute the Asar Mamoris until it reaches that level. And now you understand, it's Islapshus. It can be Islapshus. Why is it so important to know all of this? Why does he have to get into it? What's a negeh? It's negeh because the second point, which is the chiddush of the Baal Shem Tov, is that the Dvar Havaya is mislabish in the Nivra. In order to be mislabish, it has to made to measure, it has to fit. How does it fit? Asar Mamoris is only 10 Mamoris. Which Maimah Leki, which is a Maimah Kloli, is going to fit inside an Evan? The answer is not the whole Maimah is going to fit in. From that Maimah, through the Ishtalshus of Oisius, you will get Oisius which will fit inside an Evan. This is Oisius Evan. And that's the Shmaya Sheikru Rosh HaKodesh as he finishes off. And it's not just Gilgul HaOisius, it's also Chilufim and Tmuris and Gematias, as he mentions as he goes through the Perek, that not every Niva is able to receive directly. So even in these Oisius themselves, they're Mischalef. Chilufim is also a form of Ishtalshus Oisius. What's a Tmura? Even in Halacha, what's a Tmura? A Tmura is you're taking, why is it also to make a Tmura in a Korban? You're not allowed to say this is Tmura's that. Because, as the Rambam says it, from Hilda's Tmura, if somebody may take a nice animal that's for a Korban and decide this is too nice, so you get an animal which is lesser chshivas and make it Tmura. So you're going down. So Tmura represents you're going down a level. So that we don't. This is exactly what we don't want in the Korban, but in here this is exactly what we're looking for. That the Chayes Elichi is going down until it can reach a Nivra Prati and be mislavish, and that's Shmoya Sheikhlo. That's his shame of that Nivra.
Why is this so different than the premise we understood earlier about the Harkav? That we need to get to Tzirif in order to get the Ribui of Nivraim. Why can't we understand?
There was no Shaila. There's no Shaila, in other words. If the Alter Rebbe would have been worried about how do you get to a Ribui Nivraim, that's not Be'emes in the Shaila over here. That Shaila is in a mission in Ovis. Asar Mamoris Nivraim. How do you get to a Ribui Nivraim from Asar Mamoris?
The answer is the same.
No, the answer is two aces build up two words. Three aces makes six words. And so forth. In other words, Chalkus and Ribui doesn't mean Ma'ila Mata. If you want a Ribui Nivarim, this is not a problem the Alter Rebbe has to deal with. That's a Shail in Pirkei Avos. How do you get from Asar Mamoris to billions of Nivraim? The answer is that Sirufim, it could be in many different ways. But Ma'ila Mata, that's what he wants to be Machadish over here. That the Oisius are mislabish in this Nivra, and it has to do with this Nivra Bifrat, which is on a much lower level. Yes, it can work. There's a Seder of Ma'ila Mata in the Sirufim. That's why he brings this Sefer Yitzir. The only thing which we'll do for next time is, you'll notice that there's two problems over here. Number one, Oisius, which is the main theme over here, is Mamala Kolam or Seir Kolam. Oisius is Kelim, it's Mamala, it's Pratim, details. Seviv is Blikvul. Which is Mahavi Yishmael, Mamala Kolam or Seir Kolam?
Save it through Mamale.
So that's what you have to make clear over here. He's only discussing the Chelik HaMamale with the Koyach of Seviv. Maybe we'll discuss that a bit more with Pratis, which is also negate the Pshat over here. Why he calls it Chayas. We'll talk about that next time. But the other question, another interesting thing is we see the whole time he's talking about the Oisius, the Oisius, the Oisius. A whole pilpul about Oisius. This is Masechtas Oisius. This whole period is Masechtas Oisius. Now, if you were to go back to Chelik Rishon of Tanya, where he also talks about After Hashem, Perek Chof and Chof Aleph, see if he mentions it at all, or maybe once or twice, if he mentions the word Oisius. Perek Chof and Chof Aleph, and Chof Beis, he discusses After Hashem, and he also talks about how you get down to Nivroim, also with Derech Mulmai V'Lamato, and he talks about Dibur and Tzimtzum and all of that, but he doesn't mention the word Oisius.
Safe Perek Chof.
So Perek Chof, he might mention the word Oisius. Yeah. Okay, but there he's talking about.
So,
Yeah, there he's talking about where Oisius come about. But
right.
in the pilpul of how you get down to the Nivroim, he mentions the word Simtzum, which we come up. I don't even know if the word Simtzum is mentioned over here. Yeah, it does. Towards the end of Perek Alef, At Sheyuchol is Tzamtzim Lislavish. So the word Simtzum is mentioned once. But look at Perek Chof Beis. When he talks about the Tzimtzumim, after he's already mentioned it enough times, he says, Dibur Teich Roshim B'nei Adam, it's called Dibur Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he's all talking about the same subject, Dibur. Kachu Yeridis Hamshachas HaChayis L'Tachtenim B'Tzimtzumim Rabim Matzumim, Minim Minim Shoinim Liboris Membruim, Govru V'Otzma Tzimtzumim V'Heste Polim Atshuch L'Shavas V'Vos Gam Tvorim Tmeim. Here is Masechtas Tzimtzum, here's Masechtas Oisius. Why the difference in the way it's being discussed? So, we'll leave it for next time.